Oh, hello, individuals and other individuals. I am Don of Caricatures by Don. I'm about to do another of my red pencil sketches, and I'll make a video as I go along. This is Frida Kahlo, who was one of the names that came up on my follower request month. Those of you who have been following me know that my follower request month was in March. I apologize to the person who requested Frida that it's taken me this long to get around to her. I really wanted to make a video of sketching Frida, and so it had to wait until I could find time to fit that into my schedule. I'm not a full-time YouTuber at this point. So anyway, I am about to do that video, and I will, as always, will talk about my process as I go along, the choices that I'm making, and hopefully give some tips to any beginning caricaturists as I go along. Hope that you enjoy it. Okay, I am ready to begin. I have my photos on my iPad here of Frida Kahlo. Now, one thing that is a little intimidating about this one is that I actually have tried on a few occasions before to do caricatures of Frida and was not happy with the results. So I'm going into this with that already dwelling in my mind, but I'm gonna do my best here to come up with something that I like. First of all, I'm going to look for photos that are from this angle, where she's looking toward our left. The reason I want to do that is that if I can get a successful sketch of her later, I want to turn it into a finished piece based on her self-portraits. And most of the self-portraits that I've seen of Frida Kahlo, she is facing that direction. So I want my rough sketch to adhere to that. Now, one thing I want to remember here is that I want to try to keep it fairly small. And the reason for that is that I want to make sure that I include her long neck. You can see in all of these photos, her neck is notably long, and I want to make sure that I exaggerate that. So I'm going to try to keep the head pretty small so that I can give her a long neck. Her head seems to be wider at the top. Her cranium is fairly wide and then narrows coming down to her chin. The things that I most immediately notice, of course, her eyebrows. I think that's her most distinguishing feature, and she never shied away from calling attention to them when doing her own self-portraits. And she also has fairly large eyes, with an upward slant to them, thick lips. She has a nose that, and here's another illustration of why it's good to have multiple photos from different angles. If you look at her from the front, her nose is short in terms of vertical length, but long horizontally. So if I just drew her from a front view, I would emphasize just a little short nose, but given that I'm going from a 3/4, I want to also make sure that the length horizontally is reflected, and it's got a bit of a downward slant to it that I'm also going to add some emphasis to. She's also got some fairly flared nostrils. I'm going to play with that. Somewhat pronounced space between her nose and her mouth, and then her lips kind of jut forward. So I'm going to draw this sort of a shape for her philtrum, and then the lips will be thick and forward. The relationship between her top lip and bottom lip, I enjoy calling attention to the way the top lip comes out further on the ends than her bottom lip. So it's almost like the corners of her mouth overlap the bottom lip. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm bringing that corner of the top lip down like that so that the bottom lip comes out from underneath it. Now, here's an interesting thing about caricature, I find. One thing that we as caricaturists battle is people's perception. What I mean by that is that people perceive things differently in reality than they do in a drawing. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's what we're up against. Here's an example. You can see the corners of her mouth curve up a little bit. She's not smiling in this photo. It's kind of a neutral expression, but the corners of her lips do curl up a little bit. And people can look at that and see that she's not smiling, and they don't think in their minds, oh, she's smiling because the corners of her mouth are curled up. But when they see it in a drawing, especially a caricature or a cartoon, our minds have been conditioned, I think, by cartoons to think of that curl up at the end as meaning a smile. And so if I draw it the way it's seen in the photo, people are going to think that I'm drawing a smile. There are other examples of this, but I think it's an interesting enough topic that I would like to sometime do a whole video on it. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. So what I have to do to combat that is draw it a little differently than what I see. I'm not going to have it quite go up like that. Instead, I'll curve it this way without the upward curl. Now, another thing. In the photo, we can see both corners of the mouth, but because I have chosen to draw her lips jutting forward, that means when we think about it in 3 dimensions, this corner of the mouth is going to kind of pull back and get largely hidden behind the bottom lip there. So I'm not quite drawing it the same way I see it in the photo. The shape of her lip, I think I have wrong, though. It doesn't curve up. After this peak right here, it doesn't continue to curve up, which I had drawn here. And instead, it's going to come down from there. There's those eyebrows I was talking about. I think to exaggerate the unibrow, I am going to just make it one solid shape straight across. I'll give her some forehead, but I don't think it's a prominent feature of her face. The width of it is, as I talked about earlier, she's got a wide cranium, but it's not a particularly high forehead. So her hair will start right about here. I am going to run off the top of the page with the headdress she's wearing here, but I don't mind sacrificing that as it's not really part of her likeness. She's got prominent cheekbones. You can already see I've started working with that. And then the bottom half of her face, as I mentioned, is narrower. Not an especially small or especially long chin. And she does have, hard to see in this photo, but I noticed in some of the others that there is a bit of a cleft chin, a little bit of a dimple there. Not enough to bring a whole lot of emphasis to exaggerate, but it is there. I want to be aware of it, especially when it comes to the rendering part, where I start doing shading. And her ears, again, this photo doesn't really show it as much, but I did notice in the other photos that she does have fairly large ears, especially her ear lobes, and the top and bottom of her ears kind of stick out more than the middle part. So I'm going to exaggerate it to this kind of a shape with those earlobes hanging down, pulled down by the weight of her earrings. and that long neck. You may notice that I tend to spend some time making sure that I have eye shape just right. In my observation, eyes do more to capture a likeness than any other part of the face. I'm always careful to try to get the eyes just right. Of course, I do try to get all the features right to really nail down the likeness the best I can. The eyes, I find, are the most important. She's also always notably has a little bit of noticeable facial hair. That's another thing that it's interesting about Frida Kahlo. I don't know much about her personally. I haven't really studied her life, but it seems to me by the self-portraits I've seen of her that she wasn't really concerned with standards of beauty that people tend to impose on women, such as the little hint of mustache. She never bothered to try to hide it. And like I mentioned earlier, the unibrow, not traditionally considered an attractive feature, but she doesn't seem to have cared in her life about impressing people that way. Here's my rough sketch, or my very basic sketch, and I'm going to start going in now and finalizing some more details and doing some rendering. The hair seems to be growing at this angle. It must be her natural part right there in the middle, because all the hair grows outward from that center point. Too much. Again, because it's not really part of her likeness, I'm not going to worry too much about getting all the details of this headpiece right, but I want to at least get a representation of it. Thing that tends to get edited out of my videos is the number of times I resharpen my pencil. When doing this kind of rendering, it's very important to keep a good sharp pencil for these tiny little details, especially in things like the hair. So you may not see it in all of my videos, but I do tend to sharpen often. Stray hairs there for realism's sake. Hair is very, very seldom perfectly orderly. If you go in close enough, you can see the little flyaways that just naturally happen. I am always grateful that I live in a time where I can use technology like an iPad for my reference photos, so that I can zoom in nice and close on details when I need to. A lot of times when I'm working on my celebrity works in between customers at the waterfront, sometimes I have my reference photos printed out to work from, and instinctively habitually go in and try to zoom in on them when I want to see something closer. And for some reason, it doesn't work. I'm at an age where I remember a life before there even was an internet or technology of this sort. And whenever I wanted reference photos, I had to try to borrow books from the library or look through magazines and stuff. And they weren't always very easy to find. So thank you, Internet, for existing. I'll do a little bit of shading on the headpiece. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, as I said, and I'm not as concerned about getting the details on things like clothing and accessories as much as I am getting the face right. That's just a style I prefer, especially when sketching, but sometimes even in my finished works, I'll go to less effort on things like clothing, just because I'm trying to keep the focus mainly on the face. So by toning back the detail in other things, I can draw the eye more to where I want people looking, which is at their face. I almost did this, trying to go pull back on my drawing instead of on the photo. Now we're going to start rendering the face here. You can see that her forehead is largely highlighted. Not a lot of shadow going on up there, but this side of her head is more in shadow, so I will start there, I think, by getting those shapes in there with shadows. In one of my previous sketch demonstration videos that if you need help identifying a person's defining features, particularly with famous people, it can help to go look at what other caricaturists have done. If you do an internet search for caricatures of that person, I did that with Frida. And what was interesting was to see how differently different caricaturists interpreted what her defining features were. Some people had her with more of a round face shape. Some had with a longer face shape like I have here. Some people had small eyes. Some people had her with large eyes. Some people interpreted the shape of her nose differently and the shape of her lip. It was really interesting to me to see all the different ways that all these caricaturists had gone with exaggerating Frida's features while still not losing the likeness. One thing that I learned from a fellow artist, and I believe it was Ewan McTavish, who I first read on the internet saying this. He pointed out that when you're going for a more realistic rendering, it's not so important with a graphic, cartoony sort of style of rendering. But when you're going for something more realistic, these bottom eyelashes, if you look closely at photos, don't quite come out right from this line of the eye. They're growing out of the bottom eyelid, and you can usually see a bit of the top edge of that bottom eyelid between the iris and lashes. So ever since he pointed that out, I try to keep just a little bit of a gap there between the edge of the eye and the bottom lashes. Ewan McTavish, by the way, is an excellent artist. His background is more in portraiture, but I first became aware of him when he was just starting to try his hand at caricature, and most of what I've seen from him since then has been caricatures, but he does them in a really nice rendering style that looks like oil paint. He paints them digitally, but knows how to make them look like oil paints. They're really nice. If you can find Ewan McTavish on the internet, go check out his work. One thing that I learned early on, I think this is fairly well-known tip among artists, but if you're just new to it, one little tip I can give you is that putting a highlight in the eye, these little white spots that you can see in these photos, make sure that you get those in there because they do a surprising amount to bring life to the drawing. Occasionally, I have been working from reference photos where there really isn't any highlight. The light isn't hitting the eye at the right angle to create that highlight, but I'll put it in anyway. Take a little artistic license there and put it in because it really makes the drawing come to life a lot more. I don't know if you observed what I just did there. I went in, erased this hard line I had along this edge of the nose just a little bit, because you can see here in the photo that it's not quite so rigidly defined. So for the sake of realism, I have a tendency to forget that this edge of the nose should blend in more when I'm first drawing it. Then I often end up having to go back in and just soften it a little bit. There's also, you can see, not really much of her, that would be her right side, the one on our left, her nostril showing on the side of her nose, but because I'm exaggerating the flare of her nostrils, I'm showing more of it over here. Her face is more in shadow, so I'm going to go ahead and fill this whole area in with shadow here. I will darken and lighten that shadow as needed to get the contours that I'm looking for, but I can start with just kind of filling in a large area. There we have it. That is my caricature sketch of Frida Kahlo. Hope that you like it. I hope that you think it looks like her. I hope that the person who requested Frida Kahlo on my follower request month likes this drawing. I am Don. This is Caricatures by Don, and I still haven't thought of a good catchphrase to sign off my videos with yet. See you next time.